Ford is finally building an affordable electric truck. But are they building the right vehicle? And more importantly, who exactly are they building this vehicle for? I have some questions, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll help me answer some of them. Now let's go ahead and get into this. First, I have to give Ford some credit here. The Fathom is being built from the ground up as a purpose-built electric truck. It's a clean sheet vehicle, and I think that's the approach they probably should have taken with the F-150 Lightning. Now, this isn't Ford's first purpose-built EV. The Mustang Mach-E was designed as an electric vehicle from the beginning. Before its first electric truck, the F-150 Lightning took a different approach. It was based heavily on the existing F-150 architecture rather than the clean sheet electric truck. You know, what's really interesting, a lot of people probably forgot this, is that Ford had a partnership with Rivian to build an electric skateboard for their vehicles, specifically an electric Lincoln, which never came to fruition. And I think that deal broke around 2020. And when COVID came around, the partnership was dissolved, especially when Ford realized that Rivian was going to be a competitor with the R1 series. So Ford certainly understood the concept of building a clean sheet electric vehicle. But instead of taking advantage of that partnership and building their own purpose-built electric pickup truck, the company eventually went its own way with the Lightning. But now we're getting a Fathom, and this time Ford is starting with the EV architecture and then building a vehicle around it. And I think that's the right engineering approach. But there's another question that's just as important. Is this the right product? Because those are not the same thing. Good engineering does not guarantee good product strategy. Lucid is a good example of this. From an engineering standpoint, I think Lucid makes the best vehicles. I think they have the best packaging. They have really the best range, really good charging, just a highly technically advanced vehicle. Lucid clearly knows how to engineer an electric vehicle. But the Lucid Air is also a large, expensive luxury sedan, and in a market where buyers are increasingly looking at SUVs and crossovers. You can build the most incredible sedan, but if fewer people are shopping for large luxury sedans, your engineering does not solve that problem. Then Lucid brought out the Gravity, and technically it's a 3-row SUV, and it appears to be a very impressive vehicle. Again, probably the best engineered, best packaged SUV on the market, period. I could not wait for this vehicle to come out. But when I saw it, I was like, this looks like a minivan in its overall shape and proportions, and personally, that's where it lost me. If I'm spending $80,000, $100,000 or potentially more on an electric vehicle, I don't want something that's going to remind me of a minivan. It's just not my personal preference. I know other people may love it, but for me personally, I just don't want a vehicle that looks like a minivan. The broader point isn't whether I personally like the Gravity. It's that being really good at building something doesn't automatically mean you've chosen the product that the market wants. Engineering and market fit are two completely different things. And that's what concerns me about the Fathom. I'm not questioning whether Ford can make a good electric truck. They already proven they can with the F-150 Lightning. I'm questioning whether an affordable electric pickup truck is a product Ford should be building first on this platform. Because Ford has a problem that Lucid doesn't have. Ford already makes a vehicle that can be one of the Fathom's biggest competitors. And that takes us to the Maverick problem. Let's say you have somewhere around $30,000 to spend and you're looking for a small truck. You walk into the Ford dealership because you heard about this new electric Fathom. Then you see the Maverick. Now you have a real decision to make. The Maverick Hybrid gets an EPA estimated 42 miles a gallon in the city. You get excellent fuel economy without having to install a charger at home, or to worry about where you're going to charge on a road trip. If you decide tomorrow that you wanted to take a trip across the country, you can. You stop for gas, spend a few minutes filling up, then you keep moving. And then there's capability. The Maverick can tow up to 4,000 pounds. And where properly equipped, it has 1,500 pounds of payload capacity. We don't have the Fathom's final towing or payload numbers yet, and so I'm not going to assume it's going to perform poorly. But Ford is going to have to give its customers a reason to choose the Fathom over something that's already proven itself in the market. And that's the problem. If somebody specifically wants an EV, then that decision may be pretty easy. But what about somebody who simply wants an affordable truck? That customer is going to compare the entire package: purchase price, range, capability, convenience, and operating costs. And once you look at it that way, being electric is just one part of the equation. The Fathom has some potential advantages. If you could charge at home, waking up every morning with a charged vehicle can be incredibly convenient. And depending on your electricity rates, the cost per mile can be significantly lower than gasoline. There should also be less routine maintenance, and also Ford has talked about bidirectional charging capability, which is a tremendous benefit that you cannot get from a Maverick. But the question is, does that outweigh everything that the customer is going to give up? And that's where the battery becomes really important. And that leads us to the small battery gamble. Ford has confirmed that this vehicle is going to use LFP batteries, and that makes total sense for an affordable electric truck. LFP batteries are generally less expensive and they're more durable, and the best thing is that you can charge them to 100% without having the same negative impacts that it may have on a lithium-ion chemistry. The downside of LFP is that it's more cold sensitive, which means you can lose a lot more range during the winter months. Good thermal management and preconditioning can help, but if you're buying one of these vehicles in a place where it gets extremely cold outside, that's something you're probably going to want to pay attention to. And Ford hasn't given the final battery capacity EPA range yet, but we've seen reports that are suggesting that this is going to be around a 50 kilowatt hour battery. And if that number is accurate, this truck is going to have to be extremely efficient. And just doing some quick math in my head, if this vehicle gets around 3 miles per kilowatt hour, you're looking at around 150 miles of range. And to get around 200 miles of range, you're going to need to get closer to 4 miles per kilowatt hour. And now just for example, the Tesla Model Y, which is a very efficient vehicle, gets probably around 4 miles per kilowatt hour, maybe a little more. But that's how efficient that this vehicle will have to be just to get 200 miles of range on a full charge. And now that's not an EPA range prediction. We don't know what the usable capacity is going to be for this battery or the actual battery size. And so we're just going to have to wait and find out what those numbers are going to be. I'm using that math to illustrate a challenge. Ford is trying to get useful range out of a relatively small battery. And I actually like that strategy. We've seen EV manufacturers put enormous batteries in vehicles over 200 kilowatt hours in order to solve the range problem. And that does work, but it also increases the cost and the weight of the vehicle. And then you're using a lot of extra energy to lug this big old heavy battery around that may not have any charge left in it. If Ford can get enough range to efficiency instead, that is smart engineering. But then the question is, what happens when you start using this thing like a truck? Because it's a truck after all. Cold weather reduces range, highway driving is going to decrease efficiency, and towing can have a significant impact where you can probably lose more than 50% of your range. And if you're already starting with a relatively small battery, you don't have a lot of energy in reserve when those conditions start to work against you. And for a commuter just driving 30 miles a day, this may be totally irrelevant. But for a truck buyer, that can matter quite a bit, which takes us right back to the question, who is this vehicle for? Before I go any further, if you're enjoying this video, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and also hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit that hype button too. It really helps support the channel. Now let's talk about that $28,000 starting price, because this is where the Fathom can be extremely compelling or start to lose its advantage. Now let's go ahead and get back into this. $28,000 sound great, but what does that actually buy? Ford says the standard range Fathom is going to start around $28,350 before destination. That's a very attractive number for a new electric truck. But remember what that number represents. That's your entry point. Once destination's added, you're looking at around $30,000. And then we need to find out what Ford is going to charge for everything beyond the basic truck. If the standard battery does end up around a reported 50 kilowatt hours and the customer wants more range, how much is a larger battery going to cost? What about all-wheel drive? What equipment comes standard? And what gets pushed into the higher trims or option packages? We don't know yet. And then you have the dealership itself. When these vehicles hit the dealership, we have to see if they sell close to MSRP or if there are going to be some substantial dealer markups like there were with the F-150 Lightning. And I'm not saying the Fathom is going to be a $40,000 truck once you configure it the way you want it. We don't have enough information to say that. Well, let's say the longer range version, equipped the way most buyers want, starts approaching $35,000, $40,000. That changes the value proposition. At $28,000, you got my attention. As you start getting close to $40,000, I'm looking around. I was like, what else is out there? And at that point, a better equipped Maverick becomes a very viable option. And depending on incentives and the actual transaction price, you can start looking at larger vehicles like the Ford Ranger or the F-150. And that's a very difficult position for the Ford Fathom, because now you may be paying more money for a smaller truck that potentially gives you less range and less capability than something on that same Ford lot. And the EV advantages have to be significant enough to overcome that. And we've already seen this problem play out with other electric trucks, which takes us to the Silverado EV problem. Look at the Chevy Silverado. GM can sell you a gasoline Silverado or a Silverado EV. And the Silverado is a very impressive electric truck. GM has managed to get tremendous range out of some of these versions while still offering a lot of truck capability. But doing so requires a lot of battery, over 200 kilowatt hours. A large battery costs money, so now the customer walks into the dealership and they can compare both vehicles directly. Maybe the gasoline truck costs substantially less, and the electric truck is going to have to justify that $10,000, $20,000 price difference. If you're charging at home and driving a lot, maybe the operating costs make sense. Maybe you love the performance of the electrical features. There are certainly customers like myself that's going to prefer EV, but someone who primarily cares about towing, long distance driving, an initial purchase price may look at the gasoline truck and wonder, why should they spend more money? Ford is going to have that exact same problem. Actually, the Fathom may have a tougher comparison because the Maverick Hybrid is already extremely efficient. The fuel cost advantage of going electric doesn't disappear, but the gap becomes a lot less dramatic when you're comparing the EV with a truck that's getting 40 miles a gallon instead of a full-size pickup truck that's getting considerably less. And that's an important distinction. And see, the thing is, Ford isn't asking someone to switch from a gas guzzler to an EV. In many cases, it may be asking someone to switch from an efficient hybrid to an EV, and that makes the value proposition much harder. What did Maverick sales actually tell us? There's something else about the Maverick I think Ford needs to be careful about. Maverick is sold extremely well, and that clearly demonstrates demand for a smaller truck. But what exactly were those customers buying? Were they buying the Maverick because they wanted an electrified pickup truck? Or were they buying it because trucks had become so expensive that there was an opening for something that was more affordable? I think affordability is a major part of the story. People wanted a useful truck that didn't cost $50,000 or $60,000, and Ford gave them one. The hybrid made the package even more attractive because now you can get excellent fuel economy without changing anything about your lifestyle. That's a fantastic value proposition. But somebody wanting an affordable truck does not necessarily mean they want an affordable electric truck. Those are not automatically the same customer. And this is where I think Slate has done something interesting. Slate may have a better defined customer. I've already done a video on the Slate Truck, and I've said it's probably going to be a niche vehicle, and I still believe that. But being niche isn't necessarily a weakness. In fact, it can be a strength. If you understand exactly who your customers are, you build something just for them, you don't need everybody. Slate is supposed to start around $24,950 before destination and offer around 205 miles of estimated range. That's deliberately simple. They're stripping out features and complexity because they're trying to make the vehicle inexpensive. When I look at Slate, I can immediately imagine who the customer base may be. I can see small businesses, a maintenance company, fleet vehicle use, a contractor who spends most of their day within the same general area. I can see it as a delivery vehicle. I can see multiple customers for this vehicle. And maybe the vehicle travels anywhere from 80 to 100 miles every day before returning to the place it charges every night. And for those customers, around 200 miles of range can be completely adequate. Slate doesn't need to replace an F-150 for their customer. It just needs to do the job that they have. And that's why Slate's compromises make a lot more sense to me. In fact, that's actually the appeal of the vehicle. And kind of why it appeals to me in a lot of ways. It kind of reminds me of the days where I had to crank windows and I work on my own vehicle. It brings back a lot of nostalgia for me. And there's a lot of appeal in that. And so there's a clear reason for that product to exist. I don't think Slate is going to dominate the American truck market. It doesn't have to. If it finds a profitable niche and it serves that niche well, that's a viable strategy. Strangely enough, I think this gives Slate an advantage over Ford in this particular comparison. Now I know who might buy the Slate, but I'm still trying to figure out who Ford expects to buy the Fathom. Now where would I put my money? If you put the Fathom and the Slate in front of me today and told me I had to choose based on what we currently know, I'm more than likely taking the Slate. Not because I think the Slate can build a better vehicle than Ford. Ford has more than a century of automotive expertise, enormous engineering resources, and established supply chains and dealerships all over the country. The Fathom may end up being a much more refined vehicle. My preference comes down to purpose. With Slate, I understand what I'm buying. I like the idea of having a vehicle I can just throw anything into. I can replace the panels. I'll be less concerned about damage from accidents, probably lower insurance costs. I understand what the vehicle's purpose is for, and it appeals to me. The Fathom is a little more complicated. If I want an affordable, everyday truck, I'm probably going to look at a Maverick. And if I drive in these, I'm limited enough to where 200 miles of range work perfectly well. Now I wonder whether the less expensive Slate could do that job. Ford has to find enough buyers to fall into this space between those two options. Maybe there's millions of them, but Ford still needs to show me what makes the Fathom uniquely compelling to their customer. Then there's the dealership problem. Ford has another issue that Slate doesn't have, the dealership. Imagine someone walking into a Ford dealership because they're curious about the Fathom. This might be their first EV and they have questions about installing a charger, public charging when a range, battery life, and what happens when they tow. And hopefully the salesperson knows enough about electric vehicles that they'll be able to answer those questions. But if the customer starts getting nervous, there's an easy alternative. Walk them right over to a Maverick. Now the conversation becomes a lot simpler. You don't need a charger. You already know how to fuel it. It gets excellent gas mileage. And the dealership still sold a Ford. And I'm not saying that Ford dealers are going to intentionally steer people away from the Fathom. I'm saying the incentives are different. If Rivian loses an R1T customer, They don't have a gas truck to sell them instead. Slate won't have that option either, and neither does Tesla, but Ford does. And then there's another wrinkle. Car dealerships usually get the majority of their profits from the service department. Now, electric vehicles still requires maintenance, but it's a lot less than what you'll have on an internal combustion engine vehicle. And that can be a huge profit loss for a car dealership. So Ford isn't only trying to convince customers to adopt a new technology. It's introducing that technology through a sales and service ecosystem that has spent more than a century making money off internal combustion engine vehicles. And that doesn't make the transition impossible. It just makes Ford's job more complicated than Slate's. So who is this vehicle actually for? And that's where I land with the Fathom. I think Ford may be doing some very good engineering here. A purpose-built electric truck is the right way to approach an electric pickup. The smaller LFP battery could be the smart way to attack costs if Ford can get enough efficiency out of it. And if they manage to deliver a useful electric truck for around $30,000, that's a big accomplishment. Lucid is a perfect reminder that engineering is in the whole game. You can build something that's technologically impressive and still misread the market. And that's the part I'm watching with Ford, because the Maverick already makes sense. It's affordable, efficient, practical, and flexible. And Slate makes sense for a completely different reason. It's basic, relatively expensive, and aimed at a customer that can live with its limitations. The Fathom has to establish its own reason for existing between those two. If Ford gives this truck good real-world range, respectable towing and payload capability, and keeps the desirable versions close to the advertised price, maybe the answer becomes obvious. But if the standard truck only gives you around 200 miles of range, and getting more range and capability pushes the price up to around $40,000, I think Ford is going to have a much harder sell. Because at that price point, the customer is no longer asking, is a Fathom a good EV? They're asking whether it's a better vehicle for their money than everything else they can buy. And some of the strongest alternatives are going to be sitting right next to the Fathom on the same dealer lot. And that's why I keep coming back to the question I asked at the beginning. Who exactly are they building this for? Because building a good vehicle is one thing. Building a vehicle that people actually want to buy is something else entirely. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. If the Fathom and the Maverick were sitting on the same lot at roughly the same price point, which one would you choose? And if you're specifically looking for an affordable electric truck, would you take the Fathom or the Slate? I really want to hear your reasoning. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. But that's all I have for today. I'd like to thank you for joining me once again. And I can't wait to see you in the next video.